Well, thank you very much for inviting me to speak here today. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person, but at least we can use modern technology to have some degree of interchange. The title of my talk is Innovation Policy as Cargo Cult. This is a deliberately provocative title, but I do think it has some particular resonance in the way that policy is often formulated, and there are some important lessons in thinking about the way you can use international comparative evidence to shape international policy in any area. The notion of cargo cult I find particularly attractive in relation to innovation policy because it's an anthropological phenomenon which has been widely studied, and it relates in particular to the way in which in the Melanesian islands in the Pacific in the post-war period a number of millenarian religious movements developed. These basically had at their root the idea that because the war had been associated with major material inputs and progress associated with the occupation forces, especially of the United States, that at the end of the war, when these forces withdrew, one could develop a possible religious movement which could appeal for the return of the cargo. These, of course, were deep-rooted movements, and they're related to quite deep movements in those islands themselves, but at their heart lay a series of actions which I think can be used to characterize some approaches to innovation policy. The cargo cult phenomenon essentially involved replicating the structures that were associated with the material gain that had occurred during the Second World War. Thus, these movements built all kinds of structures. They built bamboo aeroplanes, bamboo runways, conning towers, and so on. And the religious movement involved around following ceremonies associated with these structures in the hope that the cargo would return. Of course, the cargo didn't return. The reason why this analogy, I think, is very useful is because, quite rightly, policymakers have been concerned to try and learn from the international experience of many different countries in developing innovation policy. What I want to argue is that there are some problems in using international evidence unless it's very carefully calibrated and is rooted in quite a deep understanding of the way individual countries' innovation performance works. And in particular, when we look at various elements of policy, and today I'm going to say rather a lot about the role of universities, one has to be very careful in interpreting that role as seen in a particular economy. Now, one of the most interesting features about innovation policy is the extent to which, as in other areas, what is fashionable as policy and comes to have great currency is often linked to what are perceived to be major differences in the overall economic performance of countries. So, for instance, in the post-war period, and especially in the 1970s, great attention was paid to the institutional structures and policies of Germany and Japan as they became dominant players in international trade, and a lot of emphasis was therefore placed on understanding their institutional structures. Most recently, in relation to innovation policy, international performance of the US economy has attracted a great deal of attention. And in particular, the performance of that economy from the mid-1990s onwards led to a great interest in what might be seen as the core elements of the major change in the rate of growth of that economy which occurred from the mid-1990s onwards compared to the previous 2 decades. Now, what I want to argue is that the evidence base which relates to this is actually quite fine-grained, but that certain interpretations of it became very important in the policy development arena. Some of these interpretations are in fact being, I would argue, reinforced in the current innovation policy discussion. The central feature which is making innovation policy and the role of universities so important now is in the aftermath of the financial crisis, there is great concern about the need to potentially rebalance economies and to focus on the roles that universities can play as so-called suppliers of knowledge or core institutions in the innovation process. So what I want to do is step back a little and unpack some of the arguments that have been used in the past to support a particular interpretation of innovation policy, which I want to argue, although it's more nuanced, is still present in many discussions, including, for instance, the way in which the 2020 Horizon program might be developed. One of the most remarkable features of the late second half of the 1990s in the United States was an acceleration of productivity growth. after a couple of decades of below historic trend rate of growth of the economy, productivity and growth accelerated dramatically back to around 2.5%, and that continued through to the early part of this century. That led to great interest in what might lie behind this productivity performance, and a certain interpretation became current, which I have regarded as a cargo cult interpretation. I think there were three key elements to this interpretation of the US productivity and growth miracle, which fed into the interpretation of innovation policy. The first was that this was rooted in a fundamental transformation of the US economy linked to high technology, science-based endeavors. The second was that this was closely linked to the increased interest of universities in commercialization through patenting, spin-offs and licensing. And thirdly, this was enormously reinforced by a risk-loving, highly venture capital intensive research and development and early stage development program. I think the evidence does not support that interpretation. In fact, I think it's possible to argue, and I have argued, that all three of those are incorrect interpretations. The first argument, and one which has come home to roost in a very big way, is the interpretation of a period of economic growth based fundamentally around high technology industries. In fact, work by Robert Solow and others demonstrated quite clearly that if you decompose the productivity acceleration of the US economy in the post-1995 period, say through to 2005, the sectors which dominate productivity growth are wholesaling, retailing, financial services, and after 2000, real estate. Now, the reason they're dominant is because, as well as experiencing productivity growth, they also carry large weight in the economy. And in many ways, what happened was the transformation of sectors which are not normally regarded as high-tech sectors into implementers of a whole range, in particular, of ICT-related innovations. So the first lesson here is that the implications for an economy of transformations in technology and understanding deriving from the knowledge base does not show up necessarily in high technology industries per se. A great deal of gain is therefore to be had by the transformation of what might be called more traditional sectors. So the diffusion and use of technologies is just as important, if not more important, than the underlying origins of those technologies. The second issue relates to the role of small businesses in this process. Here again, the evidence is not really supportive of the notion that the smallest firms account for the biggest part of any productivity increase. In fact, extensive work by the OECD and others shows that in any time period, most of the productivity gain is accounted for by productivity improvements in the largest existing firms. And again, that's because of a similar problem which arises when we look at the decomposition of productivity by sectors. Big firms carry a lot of weight precisely because they are big. So if you transform their productivity growth, or they themselves transform their productivity growth, that has a big impact on overall performance. Of course, there is always great emphasis on the role of so-called gazelles, that is, the role that small, high, fast-growing firms can play in transforming the economic system. Now, personally, I find the gazelle analogy quite an interesting one. Gazelles may be quite aesthetically pleasing objects to look at, but if you ask yourself what gazelles do, well, they accumulate in very large groups, eating grass. And occasionally, they will be panicked by a random event and they will run off in all directions very quickly, but over very short distances, and some of them will be eaten. And then they'll all go back to eating grass again. Well, that's actually not a bad description of the small business population in general, but I never found it particularly convincing as an analogy as to why we should support the small firm sector in general. Now, that might sound rather disparaging of small firms, and it's not intended to be. It's intended to be an example of how dangerous using loose analogies can be in supporting a group of firms in general. There's no doubt that small firms play a particular role in some sectors at certain times. There's no doubt that they play an important feedstock role and often are acquired by larger firms and help to revitalize the innovation process. But in thinking about how to support them, the order of magnitude of their role in the economy and their specific position in particular industries has to be very carefully assessed. The third point I want to make lies in relation to venture capital. Here again, great emphasis has been placed and continues to be placed on finding various ways of subsidizing the supply of finance through supporting venture capital. And most countries in the European Union and elsewhere have made major attempts to support and develop a venture capital industry. But the experience of the United States is a very nuanced one in this area. The most important thing about thinking of the US experience in this area is to note that it is a system. And in that system, there are many different core funders of early stage technology development. The third element to the interpretation of the US productivity renaissance has focused heavily on the need to support and develop venture capital markets. This interpretation, however, needs to be a very nuanced one, because the US support for early stage technological development contains several major strands of funding which work together as a system. The first and frequently least mentioned part of this process is the role of the state. The state plays a major role through both the public procurement of R&D by major departments of defense and health, but also the use of specific programs such as the Small Business Innovation Research Program, which mandates federal agencies to spend around 2.5% of all their R&D budget on the support of small firms through placing R&D contracts. The total amount of funding which goes through these routes in the United States has been estimated to be the equal of the total amount of angel investment that goes to early stage technology development. By far the least important of funding for early stage technology development in small firms in the United States has been venture capital in the form of venture capital informal private equity markets of the kind that is often most developed by initiatives in other countries. The final piece of the jigsaw in the United States, again roughly equal in size to the amount put in by the state and by angel investors, is the role of large companies themselves through their R&D programs. Now, it's not just the relative importance of each of these that matters, but the fact that there are different stages means that one stage can benefit from the investment at the other stage. Thus, angel investors, and to the small extent they're involved venture capital, can benefit greatly from what is essentially a de-risking investment at the earliest stages by the federal agencies. This means that policies to develop any one part of this chain of activity in a European context, either at a European or national level, has to consider very carefully the connections between these stages. So what does this imply for the development of innovation policy? Well, it's true, of course, that the OECD and others are aware of the differences between countries in innovation systems. And there is a great deal of academic work which has explored these differences. The major challenge is to ensure that the nuances which arise from this are properly reflected in policy. So what I want to do in the rest of my talk today is focus on one particular aspect of this story, which is the role played by universities. And I want here to rely on some evidence that we've collected recently for the UK. In the normal cargo cult interpretation of the role of universities, a rather simple story is told. Research takes place in a university environment. This research is often conducted by people who live in a kind of ivory tower and aren't terribly interested in what's going on in the outside world. The result is we have high quality, high excellence in terms of scientific assessment of research, but very weak exploitation because there is a gap between the science excellence and the conversion of that into various kinds of public as well as private valued activities. At the heart of this interpretation lies a very particular view of the need to convert universities from so-called traditional universities into what have been called entrepreneurial universities. What I want to argue is that there is a great deal of emerging evidence which suggests that there are extensive connections already between the university base and the commercialization process, that the pathways to commercialization are many and varied and don't depend on the particular links through spin-offs and licensing which tend to dominate the debate, and that the major challenge facing innovation policy is not really converting the culture of the so-called supply side of the science base, but developing a range of institutions which can encourage the mutual discovery of interesting problems and the potential exploitation of multiple pathways to the use of activities from the science base in the both private and public sectors. So briefly, what I want to do is just refer to some evidence which we've accumulated in the UK. I want to draw in particular on a survey carried out by my colleagues at the Centre for Business Research in Cambridge, which has covered the whole of the UK academic sector and a very large sample of firms in the private sector. In all, we cover about 22,000 academics and 2,500 firms. Very briefly, what this data shows is, first of all, when asked about their activities involving external organisations, academics are actually quite deeply integrated into their societies. One shouldn't find this surprising because historically many academics have been involved in the solution of problems in the societies in which they live. And the most powerful example, which becomes a symbol of this interaction, is Louis Pasteur. In what I regard as an excellent interpretation of the development of science policy in the US in the post-war period, Donald Stokes argued that Louis Pasteur was in fact a much more accurate role model to use in the interpretation of science endeavour because of the clear link between the pursuit of basic understanding and the location of that pursuit in relation to potential uses or considerations of use. So when we asked our academics the extent to which they considered themselves as either basic researchers, applied researchers, or solely concerned with use, by far the dominant proportion regard themselves as being either involved in applied research or research which is of a basic nature but linked to potential considerations of use. And this goes across a very wide range of disciplines, all the way from philosophy to nuclear physics. Of course, there are variations by discipline, so one finds together at the more pure end philosophers and mathematicians, again showing that this is not a matter of the natural sciences versus the social sciences and the arts and humanities. The range of activities are extremely large, and they do reflect the multiple pathways through which commercializing occurs, which is beyond patenting and licensing. Thus, by far the most important set of contacts are initially informal, and they're linked to a very wide range of consulting activities, contractual, problem-solving activities, and also closely linked to the development of curricula, which can lead to the transfer of people through the recruitment at graduate and postgraduate level. And in fact, pathways through people are in many ways the most dominant form of the transfer of knowledge into potential applications as businesses and the public sector recruit new individuals to join their teams. Now, if one asks businesses a similar set of questions about what they regard as the most important contributions and links with universities, they emphasize a very similar pattern of connections. In particular, they emphasize the role of individuals, recruitment, the ability to develop through informal means to more formal contracting and collaborative research, and in general a wide set of information flow and exchange activities through, for instance, sitting on advisory boards, providing advice, as well as being involved in particular projects. Moreover, these connections span more than the science, technology, engineering and mathematics disciplines. And this is because the innovation process itself requires far more than technical and scientific knowledge. Research on innovation has increasingly revealed the great importance of a whole range of business functions to the commercialization process. This does involve accessing information external to the firm of a technical kind, but it also involves a wide range of advice on human relations, on organizational issues, on legal issues, on financial planning issues, and the result is that firms report a much wider set of engagements with universities than is captured by a narrow focus on science and technology. So, what broad conclusions might one draw from these kinds of developments? And of course, I've scratched the surface of what is a very wide range of emerging evidence in the innovation studies literature. Well, the first is that the link between innovation based on science and technological knowledge and the overall growth of the economy has to be seen as being mediated through particular sizes of firms, and in particular the role of large firms who occupy dominant places in most of our economies. That also involves carefully understanding the link between smaller firms and these large firms, and the role that the small firms in particular may play in the supply chains and in developing new ideas which are exploited by larger firms, as well as focusing just on the very spectacular growth of a few small firms to giant dominant positions, which tends to dominate the rhetoric. The second is that in thinking about the way that innovation occurs, it's important to recognize the many different components of business model development which go to the exploitation and appropriation of value. This means that in particular in developing the case for spending more, say, on the science base, it has to be recognized that ultimately the appropriation of value will depend on the location and investment decisions of major, often globally integrated players, and therefore raise major problems from a national point of view in ensuring that any investment at a national or European level is the producer of value added, employment and growth in the particular national economy or in the EU. Secondly, in relation to what this might mean for the funding of university research, I think it's important that we should recognise the holistic nature of the innovation process and the extent to which that means many disciplines are capable of contributing to this materialistic interpretation of the purpose of funding research. But more importantly, I want to argue that it is the creation of institutions which allow the discovery of connections and the exploitation of multiple pathways to be the most important lesson from the point of view of developing innovation policy. In other words, rather than focusing on the subsidization of particular flows of capital or particular types of business, attention should be paid to the way in which research support can encourage the creation of intermediate institutions which allow a greater interpersonal interplay between academics, between the private and between the public sectors. There are many examples in different economies of the way in which these intermediate institutions develop. In the case of the UK, we are beginning to experiment with some additional public funding for what originally were called technology innovation centres, but have now been rechristened the Catapult programme. And these do draw on emerging evidence about the potential role that intermediate organisations sitting on the boundary of the university-industry interface can play. The central problem here, as with the more general use of public procurement of R&D, which I think also should be a key element of policy, is to ensure that we can devise mechanisms which can effectively implement the strategies which are developed. The United States does indeed have a very effective public procurement program, but it's based on many years of learning, and it's based on being embedded in a system in which there are many key corporate players linked to the main federal funding agencies, and where there is a rich infrastructure of potential pathways to development that are known by very experienced and very professional administrators of the scheme. So, in implementing innovation policy, I think we should pay great attention to the development of the capacities to implement the policies that are being advanced. In relation to the European Union more generally, I think the lessons from the research that I have attempted to provide an overview of is that there will be a great need at a national level to locate particular developments in the particular institutional frameworks and strategies of individual economies. In providing the opportunity for individual academics or universities to bid into European-wide programs, it will be particularly important to ensure that these, in my view, encourage the establishment of appropriate intermediate organisations which are capable of spanning the boundary between the public and private sectors on the one hand and universities on the other, and that particular attention is paid to those areas of scientific advance where it's thought that there are major gains to be had by, say, increasing the scale or focus of investment and increasing the collaboration between leading firms. I would want to end, however, by arguing that the path between investing in these areas and the economic growth of the Union and the individual members of it will be not a straightforward one. And in particular, there are bound to be issues in which the potential location of key corporate investments and the commercialization processes that go with it is bound to cause problems of variation in emphasis across countries and the pursuit of national as opposed to wider European issues. This is an important challenge, and I think it's an important one that the academic community researching innovation studies can contribute to, and I think we should look forward to helping take this agenda forward and informing it with good innovation policy studies advice. There's no doubt that in the period since I originally wrote my first cargo cult paper, that the degree of detailed information and interpretation of innovation policy has changed. There have been substantial inputs by the OECD and others which have emphasized the importance of international differences, and many reports on the innovation systems of individual countries which highlight these differences. Why then should I be concerned to address the cargo cult issue again? The reason, I think, is very straightforward. I've been lucky to be involved in discussions of innovation policy in many countries in the past 5 years. And there's an important distinction between what we know based on the evidence and what tends to be the dominant rhetoric in the development of policy. I still think it's the case that there is an emphasis on the role of small, dynamic, technology-based gazelles, which the evidence doesn't support. The balance of policy support between the role that the public sector can play and between the subsidy of private sector venture capital development still seems to me to place too much emphasis on the latter. The result, therefore, is that in thinking about the way in which policy could be taken forward, and insofar as that involves imitating structures in economies which appear to be doing very well, we must develop a European model which recognizes the particular institutional circumstances and industrial structures of individual countries and the EU as a whole, and must ground those policies in a very clear behavioral understanding of what is motivating and driving activity in the research base on the one hand, and in the key commercial players and the public sector on another. That's a major challenge, but one I think we should welcome. So, in conclusion, could I thank you all again for the opportunity to speak to you. It is perhaps ironic that I'm currently in New Zealand, which is a lot closer to the cargo cult islands than I would have been if I'd been speaking to you in Brussels. And I would hope and be delighted to be involved in further discussions of the way this important policy agenda could be taken forward. So thank you once again for your attention.